Female health will not return an investment fund, and female sport will not return an investment fund. I hear from companies who go, well, only 40% of our customers are female. Why would we do something specific for them? Because it matters, because it hasn't been done. Women will reward it 1,000-fold, because ultimately women are just looking to be supported and taken care of and have their mental load reduced. So it's a massive opportunity.
My guest today, the daughter of a Kenyan father who didn't believe in cars. Roma Van der Walt was built into an endurance athlete from the age of 4, having walked everywhere to that point. By 12, she'd met the coach who would change her life, and by 17, she was writing a thesis on anaerobic threshold training, using herself as the test subject. And by the time she retired from the German national team for modern pentathlon, she had lived what she calls the monastic athlete life, the fine-tuned orchestra of elite performance. Then came the detour, the work with the UN, New York, sedentary life, and the worst health of her life. Then pregnancy, then thyroiditis, then a decision to build for herself and for every woman overlooked by a system that trains its algorithms on 90% male data. Roma Van der Walt is the CEO of Vitel. She's building the health operating system for women. And this is her story. Roma Van der Walt is a practitioner scholar whose journey spans the globe, from her roots in Germany to the high-stakes tech hubs of New York and Los Angeles. A former professional athlete on the German national team for the modern-day pentathlon, he lived the monastic life of elite performance, mastering the fine-tuned orchestra of a multimodal support team. This kinesthetic foundation, combined with a master's in sports science and a teenage obsession with aerobic threshold training, led her to identify a systemic problem in healthcare, which is the 90% male-centric data gap in female physiology. So now today, as the CEO of Vitel, she is building the health operating system for women, transforming her elite athletic background into a data-driven mission for global longevity and health intelligence. Welcome, Roma, to the DNA of Things.
Hi, Jeremy. I'm super excited to be here.
Well, I'm grateful to have you. We have a mutual friend, the folks over at Morphe, Dr. Neil Kitchen in particular. And, I've had a chance to speak to you only briefly a few weeks ago now, but I was really, I suppose, taken in by your, early, let's say, fascination with exercise physiology. As a high school student, I have a feeling that was kind of your origin and motivation into understanding physiology. But I think there's, more to it than that, given your background as a world-class athlete. I'd really love to understand, what drew you in, and, what was the moment you felt that, this was your calling? Because what you've taken on is no small undertaking. So how did it all start?
Yeah, I think movement was a really big part of my life from an even younger age than my teenage years. I had a Kenyan father, so I would say I was genetically predisposed to be an endurance athlete. Was made to walk really long distances from the age of about 4, because he didn't really believe we didn't own a car. He didn't believe in public transport. And so walking alongside him was something that to this day is just paying positive dividends, because I have an insanely low resting heart rate. And then getting to the point of being a young teenager, and then teenager in general, I met my coach at age 12, and everything in my training from that day forward was data-driven by a man who had predominantly trained female athletes and took that very seriously, by someone who believed that regular threshold training and threshold testing was something that over time would yield the best results. And so when it came to having to write a high school thesis, I ended up proposing this quite advanced topic of the anaerobic threshold and how it changes over a time span of, I think at the time it was 8 months. in an endurance athlete. And I took myself as the guinea pig and the testing object and looked at what influenced it in a multi-sport, because obviously we know that if we isolate, in this case, it was the 3,000 meters at the time, just on the track and spikes, it's very different than having to run a 3,000-meter race cross country with a mandatory elevation gain at the end of a day after 4 other events.
Wow. Okay. So you are preset at a like genetically and behaviorally and environmentally to do work very effectively and efficiently. So I say, effectively as a result of your resting heart rate, and probably efficiency, probably because there's some, economy of movement that you learn, I think, in the technical component of your sport. Just for, I have a very diverse and eclectic audience. There's some that are world-class coaches or athletes. Others are, world-class physicians or entrepreneurs. And so not everybody has a complete understanding of, what threshold means and what threshold training is. So maybe you could take me back to your 17-year-old paper, which is probably the paper you wrote when you were a 17-year-old, which by the way is probably like a university level paper, just to kind of even dumb that down a little bit, is like, why threshold training? Why is it so effective?
Yeah, I think to recap, threshold training is or threshold testing is guided by lactate, and we see that done by cyclists, we see it done by runners, and there's the 2 thresholds. So you have the purely aerobic movement that you could sustain for a very long time. So that's I don't want to delve too much into zones because that takes us more into the longevity space right now. You have your slower zones, zone 1, zone 2, dictated by your heart rate and how low you can keep it before there's a first jump in lactate. And then comes, if I take it from a runner's perspective, the zone where you run probably zones 3, 4, and you're more in the tempo run territory. So you can get a few words out and you could run that with someone. You can probably sustain it for about 40 minutes. And then it gets hard, but your recovery is still pretty good. And then there's a jump at the anaerobic threshold where suddenly there's this inflection point where it's a point of no return. So at that point, you sustain it for a short period of time and then you run to exhaustion or you cycle to exhaustion. And I would say the best way to explain to someone who is not as a scientist or a doctor in this space, but let's say has run a marathon, is when you bonk, right? When you bonk, you've exhausted your reserves and your legs give up and you well, yes, you can bonk from lactate. You can also bonk from a lack of glycogen, but let's keep it at the lactate is that your muscles lock up. There's too much lactate to keep moving forward. So the way my threshold testing looked at the time was I would run intervals of 800 meters and we would either do it on the track or fully in the lab with the oxygen mask on, would draw lactate after every 800 meter repeat, start super slow, so slow that you could basically walk it. And I would tap out at about 9 intervals. And that was when I couldn't complete the full 800 meters. And that was the end of the test. And we would look at where the lactate jumped the first time, what heart rate did that correspond to? And then we would look at where lactate took a sharp dive up again. And then that's the second threshold. And why I love threshold testing and threshold training is that you can move those thresholds. Whereas when we look at VO2 max, there's a big component of genetics, environment, and age, where if you just base someone's potential based off of their VO2 max, I think quite often we can be surprised.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for the clarification. So I'm not let's say, endurance athlete by training. I'm more of a sprinter. I did, 60s, 100, 200s. But there was a period of time where I was doing some competitive swimming for a while. And this, I guess, would have been like 20 years ago now. But we would so I think this is what you mean when you say threshold training. There was one workout that we would do. It would be like repeat 50 meters or maybe 100. And the goal was to keep your heart rate beneath a certain level. And as soon as you went over, you kind of had to wait, because what you were doing, I think, was what we were trying to do was push that edge of, where you go into the anaerobic. Because as you say, I guess we're trying to push that moment of when you might bump further and further. And another coach, I think, who was really good at this, although we didn't use the terms, the sports science terms that you did, maybe he did. I wasn't intimately familiar with him, but that was Clyde Hart. So he was renowned for training the folks like Michael Johnson. He trained a lot of 400-meter runners out there at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. His formula was, and this was spaced out throughout the season, but generally, I don't think this is threshold training. Actually, I think this is like the reverse. He would have his athletes the male athletes go through 400, basically race pace, and just try to hold on for 700. And then he would walk back from that progression throughout the season where, like the next month it would be like 650 and, 500, all the way back till it might be doing some repeat 350s. And there was like a huge, according to the athletes, a huge, psychological component that comes from that over distance. But I suppose there's like a bit of a mix of things that are going on there as well. Like there's a, psychological resilience mindset, bulletproof training. There's the physiological component. There's the efficiencies of scale, that are happening there. And I guess this is like my way of kind of talking around this, monastic discipline of being the elite athlete, right? Like you described one element of your training, obviously the physiology that's core to your sport, but modern day pentathlon, maybe you could just walk us through like, what is that?
Yeah. And I love that you brought the psychology into it, because I have notes from my coach who very sadly passed away tragically 10 years ago. And he would annotate my training. So he would give me the training plan printed out, and it would say that if it was a tempo run, and we ran almost exclusively on gravel and cross country because of it was just better on the legs. I ran very little on concrete at the time. So that comes with undulations and difficulty in itself. But there would be a prescription. So if you're running a tempo run, you'll run, if my max heart rate was 198, then that would probably be around 172. There's a beauty in that, because you can excuse a session and the training times by saying, well, I stayed between 172 and 174, and it still gives the coach a data point to say, well, she just couldn't show up today at that, she should have run faster at that heart rate. So I think we've seen training methodologies evolve, and sometimes it's good to keep the psychology there as well. Like he would take me aside at times and just say, look, these next 3 intervals, you're running by feel, and I want you to just go balls to the wall. Like, we're not going to look at your heart rate, because I need you to push yourself. You cannot, it's nice to have that framework, but it's not what's going to happen in the pentathlon. And if I go back to that, then is in the pentathlon at the time, you had 5 disciplines. You still do, but they've changed recently. So you started the day with shooting, and shooting was an isolated event. So it was 40 shots, each 1 minute long, fully cognitive, fully psychological. You prepare yourself to raise your arm. You shoot freestanding. You have the 40 seconds. It's all connected to your breath. I was a very good shot, and you're trying to the max scoring was 200 points. And you're trying to get to as close. You want 20 perfect 10s. And my best was between 198, which meant I was like psychologically in a really good space, like calm myself down at the time. Now the shooting and the running are combined, and you're shooting targets and you're shooting after you run. So it's a very different sport, because you're not shooting precision anymore. You quote unquote just have to hit the target. After that, you go into the fencing event, which was each athlete against each other athlete in a field of 32, 1 hit, 60 seconds, which you're switching from super calm to super explosive, like still cognitive, but now you have about 2.5 hours ahead of you, where every bout that you don't win will cost you about 40 seconds in the run. So it's very hard to make up. Then you go into a swimming pool, you swim 200 meters freestyle, not my strongest event, but as long as I could hold on, I was okay. Then you jump on a horse, which was recently abolished. The horses are no longer part of the modern pentathlon as of LA 28. And you jump an obstacle course for which you have about 2 minutes on a horse you've never met. So you get 15 minutes with the horse ahead of time. It has to have gone through the obstacle course without mistake under its owner. So it's provided by the organizer. And then you get 5 test jumps. And after that, you're hoping again for a perfect score. And then the run at the time was forgetting the term. It was basically the leading athlete after 4 events would go into the race first, and the whole field would chase you. And that's what I meant when you don't know. Like, you could go into that run and have a huge buffer, and you can basically just walk it home. Or you could go into the run knowing you're a strong athlete in the run, but there's someone on your heels with only 10 seconds behind you, and you're going to have to know exactly how to divvy up the 3,000 meters so that you either, maybe you're stronger at the start and you're going to hold on for dear life, or maybe you're stronger at the end. And so you might let them catch up a little bit. And then at the very end, you'll go for it. And just fun fact, my coach would sit me down in his car before every run. 4 events done, you change into your running clothes, you've done your warm up, and would blast a Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name of, to get me ready to often, at least at the national level, defend whatever, buffer I had bought myself.
Your coach sounds like a legend.
He was. He really was.
Wow. What a mental game. I'm glad we went through that, because just even how much the sport has evolved from when you were doing it versus now. Like, one event's completely changed out, but even just the order of events changing makes it for a totally different sport, right? Like shooting after you run, for example, that's like a totally different game. I think the reason why what you said about your coach resonates with me so much is because I had this incredible coach also. And, I was a walk-on in university. I was a boxer before starting in university. And I realized quickly that like boxing wasn't going to mix with my genetics PhD, let's say, because even when you're not fighting, you're sparring with guys, you twice your age, weight, and experience. And soccer players will tell you even that, they're pretty banged up just hitting their head against a soccer ball. So even though you got the kid gloves on and you're wearing the headgear, it's you go a couple hours every day. It's just not good for cognition in the long term. So I knew I had to make a change. And like you, I love to move, and I just was looking for a sport that where was it socially acceptable to move for like 20 to 40 hours a week. And I did both varsity swimming and track, and I really leaned into track probably because I met my coach, and at the time when I met him, he was a 70-year-old Trinidadian sprint guru, and he had one of these bread and butter workouts that was it was called 20 times 100. I was running in the indoor season, so it was 60 meters. So he actually adapted it to like 20 times 60 meters. And the way that it worked is like, it's kind of similar to how you were describing the 800 meters, right? So the first 60 meters you would walk, right? And he would ask me, how do you feel, right? How does your body feel? Like, he would really get into that psychosomatic reality that I think athletes are so in tune with. Like so in tune with that, they step out of time, I think, when they get to that like moment of, I don't know, peak unity, let's say, that is, I think commensurate with a peak performance. So anyway, we would go through this series. So walk the first one, walk a little bit faster on the next one, walk a little bit fast, and then you're in a brisk walk. Then all of a sudden you're doing a little like kind of trot, and then you're striding, and the whole, after every one, like, how did that feel? But like you'd have to and he gets you to write it down in a journal, like, okay, well, my left glute was tight, or that felt really loose and reflexive, and he really make sure you were careful with your language, because we know like athletes self-talk, it's a huge component of their performance, right? And anyway, so then you get into your striding, and then you're getting into like, you're actually counting. Yes, he's timing it, right? But he's also looking at stride length, because he's also calculating your stride frequency, right? So those were what we were looking at, is like, what we were really looking to find was the optimal stride length and stride frequency in correlation with the best time and the best feelings, right? And then you get to a point in the workout where, I remember he'd come over and just kind of like tap me on the shoulder and be like, okay, make the next run in like, 6.6 seconds, please. It's like a time I'd never run in my life, right? And you would do it. And the thing is, like, for the longest time, I never even believed that the times were real, because they were all hand time. And then we went out and got the electronic timers, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like a 70-year-old guy hand timing is like right on with all the times. And we developed this feel, coach-athlete relationship. And, we were friends for decades. I was at his deathbed when he passed 3 or 4 years ago now. He was a friend for life. Coming back to the training session itself, I really want to pull on something that you said, because I think it's relevant, especially with where you're going now with the work that you're doing currently that I know you're all in on in terms of women's physiology and women's data-driven health. But that is coming back to these like metrics, right? And I think what we both learned from our coaches is there's a difference between a goal and a key performance indicator or a key performance inhibitor, let's say. And the thing that you had pointed to is like, well, okay, maybe I didn't run the best time on the day, but here are the other metrics that really mattered and that demonstrate that this training session was an incremental movement toward the direction where I wanted to be. Whereas if I had focused on the time as the output, I might have hurt something. I might have broken the system and it would have been totally counterproductive to where we want to go. And so to me, that's just like a wonderful jumping off point into this,
Yeah.
data void, and this idea of, well, like a hallucination problem, right? Like you called it a hallucination problem insofar as, the AIs or the algorithms, even before AIs, giving females a result or a recommendation that is just based on data that's irrelevant for them. And so, what was the moment where you made that leap from being, the athlete to becoming you became the systems architect for yourself, but I'm guessing that there was some part of you that was like, hey, this is amazing. I know what it feels like to be in my body and discover my body and have somebody believe in me to help me discover that. It kind of feels like I'm maybe reading between the lines, you're listening between the words, but it feels like there was like a passing of the torch moment.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get to where you are now from athlete, to...
Yeah. It was a long detour. I
It was.
went from being an athlete and then in university actually learning the ins and outs of the behind. So studying sports science, finishing my master's, then getting a job at the United Nations, which was completely unrelated. But it was good. It was good for me because it illustrated, first of all, I wanted to come to the States and especially New York. I just love New York as a city. And the worst illnesses and the worst health concerns I've ever had was during that time, which was a very sedentary time. It stopped essentially exercising. I went from being at my, race weight to being well over. Like today, people can't believe how heavy I was when I first stopped my career. And then my body found sort of a good middle ground, which was a first time I think that I also realized how powerful physiology is, that my body just went, okay, we were optimized, which was not necessarily always the best because in female athletes, that's an issue in and of itself. Then we went completely overboard. Psychologically, that's exactly what I needed. Exactly what I needed. I was over 40 pounds heavier than I was as an athlete when I first, about 6 months after I quit the sport. And then, I decided to listen to myself again. And I think that's something that's important to share with female audiences in particular. And over the next 18 months to 2 years, so it's not overnight, my body found like a happy medium. But then I stopped exercising pretty much altogether. I developed sciatica. That was so bad that I've never had it again, but it was also a result of the imbalances I had from fencing. There was a lot of psychological stress just being in, completely different environment. And when I left the UN, I swore to myself that I was going to find my way back into my body. And I trained with a teacher who came out of the ballet world. And he would only offer sessions of 3 hours plus. So if you wanted to work with him, it had to be 3, 4, or 5 hours. And I had a time between leaving the UN and then starting my business where I had that time. And so I said, why not? This is exactly where I want to be. So I started training 3 hours, 3 times a week with him. And because you told me that you love movement, none of it was super destructive. Like it wasn't like now people go to a really hard class. It might be CrossFit. It might even be a really hard Pilates class. And I feel like only if you can't walk the next day, you can't sit down on the toilet, was it a good class. I was there with ballerinas who were injured, and we would do the same movement again and again and again and again. And it was lengthening and strengthening. I walked out taller, more aligned, more evenly. And I did that for a good 8 months. Never had any issues with my back since then. And now I know what to return to when something pops up and I know that I'm not completely balanced. So I took that and I looked back at my coach and the whole team that supported me as an athlete. And I think I shared with you, I had my first pregnancy, which was, the pregnancy itself was fine, but then after the pregnancy, I suffered from a condition called thyroiditis. And I realized that even though I lived in a great city like New York and I had my sort of basic health coverage. Like I had my primary care physician and I could always get specialists if I needed them. I was missing this like multimodal support system that would also help me how to adjust my lifestyle, my training, my nutrition in order to get out of this transient condition. And so I built it myself. So that was the first time that I said, I'm going to basically force this connection between the doctors and then my acupuncturist, for example, whoever I knew in nutrition, and then anyone from like physical therapists to osteopaths. And I found really good people at the time. In particular, my physical therapist, first I went through thyroiditis and then I also had a hernia. So you could call that first year after having a child suboptimal. But the physical therapist looked at me and I said, I want to run a marathon in 4 months. And she said, well, you just had a baby and then you had this hernia. Now you've been like basically couldn't lift, couldn't walk, couldn't run for 6 weeks post hernia and you want to run a marathon in 4 weeks, 4 months? And I said, yeah. So she ended up videoing me and she showed me what I was running like on the treadmill. It was horrible. Like I use this as an example to like anybody who can't activate their glutes now. And she said, if you get from this to your ideal gait that you can sustain in a marathon, and you do my exercises every single day, then I will clear you to run that marathon in about 3 months. And so as I did before, that's what I did. And I matched my PR from before being pregnant. So I did that after child number 1. After child number 2, I ran an ultra marathon within 4 months after delivering with the sole purpose of figuring out how my physiology had changed during pregnancy and postpartum. And I took all of that. So when I say the detour was long, that was about 10 years, maybe a little less. But I took all of that and I said, well, why don't we make something that could help more women have a multimodal understanding of their body? I don't call it, before we thought we could actually expose women to a multimodal team that would work really well together. But now with the advent of AI and agentic AI, I think we can really create the algorithm, the machine learning, the framework that can allow women to understand these different components in their life better in tandem and then make better decisions.
And so how's it going?
When I started talking about female longevity in 2023, nobody was talking about female longevity. So that was confronting. At the time, everybody was talking about menopause, but neither I nor people around me nor women younger than me were actually thinking about menopause yet. Perimenopause, maybe, but not quite. And I wanted to take, again, as from an athlete's perspective, why would I focus on the negative? To your point with the self-talk, I wanted something aspirational. I didn't want to focus on the 100 symptoms of menopause that may or may not happen to me over the next 15 years. And so the first goal was, if all the male scientists on Instagram were talking about longevity, then we needed to distinguish female longevity within that. They weren't doing it. And to this day, I wouldn't say they're doing it well. They're still focusing on menopause and perimenopause. But I thought, if you take women who generally want to problem solve and create a better solution, then you need to meet them where they are. So at the time, we built an app and it was all based on, if we take multimodal data in, how can we help you understand your body better with recommendations that are hyper-personalized? Over time, we pivoted and we decided that the problem was more systemic. We can give women individual recommendations, but if we're going to use LLMs, for example, and those LLMs are not trained on data sets that are representative of all of us females, then we're never going to evolve at the same pace as the longevity field is evolving for men. So about a year ago, I started talking about the real issues we're facing in these LLMs. So I would model my own VO2 max, I would model my training, and the hallucinations they were so frustrating. They happened maybe not in the first line, but in the second, third. And then at some point, I was getting male VO2 max benchmarks. And so for me, that would be, Olympic level rowing. And so suddenly I was supposed to have worked towards a VO2 max of 59. And I've since sort of confirmed that with people again and again that are pretty high up in the space. I've asked a very big wearable company if there are separate scores within their product or if they were on the way. And there was a lot of confusion as to why I would ask that. But if you think about it, if we're using a wearable, I think as females, we assume that if there's two paths of physiology going in, that there's some algorithm in there that is also going to give us separate information coming out. And that's not the case. And if we look at LLMs, we're working off of 90% male physiology data because we only have 30 years of female studies, or studies, medical studies that actually include females, that are female specific. If you look at high performance, only 6 to 7% of high performance studies are female specific. So just a month ago, I was at a conference and there was the chief medical officer of a very big software company. And, it was all around, the conversation was all about LLMs and how great they are. And people can just put all their diagnostics data in. I think from a data security perspective, that's problematic. But I raised my hand and I said, well, even if we all feed all of our diagnostic data in, wouldn't you agree that there's a bigger problem if what's being put out is 90% based off of male benchmarks? And she agreed. She called it a big problem, but also a big opportunity. And so we're reaching, I think it's this year, we're reaching a point where AI is going to start being trained on AI generated information. And if you think of female health in that context and female physiology, that's a nightmare. So because now we've been feeding these LLMs over the past 2 years with billions of data points, trillions of data points. And let's say for every person that got a hallucination and thought it was right and confirmed it, we're now going to extrapolate that data and then train AI going forward with bad data. And I don't have to tell you, as a former athlete, coach, scientist, that we're perpetuating a flaw that will only create a bigger chasm and a bigger problem. And it's actually, I think it could really hurt women.
Yeah. It's to use an analogy that so you're right. Like for my graduate school work, I was focused on very, very complex and sophisticated phylogenetic analyses, disparate organisms, a lot of these like pathogenic bacteria, and they would have these, mobile genes. And there were regions in those genes that were hyper variable because there was relaxed selection pressure from time to time. But you're using these models that have been trained on, say, like vertebrate organisms where evolution is slow and the constraints are just different. There's much more but like when you try to apply, for example, like phylogenetic models built for vertebrates or invertebrates to bacterial, it's really tough to do because the selection pressures are different structurally. Let's say for like an animal that makes tissue versus a bacteria that's free living, right? And and a free living cell needs to be hyper versatile, but it can also grow as part of like a film or a mat, let's say. But anyway, the point is you if you just impose one model on another, I mean, like, to a certain point you can get some signal, but to another point you can get like serious noise. And here's where it becomes life or death. Is it depends on which gene set that I select in, say, a bacterium. There's a let's say there's a standard housekeeping set. So like the genes that are involved with information and control, DNA synthesis or repair, those tend to be like more conserved, or making proteins. Those, if you break those, the organism dies. But like different metabolic genes, like the ability to break down, antibiotics, for example, like those can be relaxed, or like, intense selection pressures on those, depending on whether or not the antibiotic isn't or absent. And then those genes can actually move laterally and like not vertically. So like you can actually get them from another species. So here's where this becomes life or death, is if I look at the backbone, the conserved region of an organism that was previously thought to be non-pathogenic, but I don't look at the hypervariable region of the genome, I can miss that this has become an invasive bacteria or multi-drug resistant bacteria. And if that taxonomy constraint is used in a clinical setting, that's going to affect somebody's care plan insofar as what antibiotics they're prescribed or how their immune system may or may not be compromised. And so that's a very specific clinical setting. But like what you're describing is like kind of on the, you're on the longevity and the wellness front, scientific wellness frontier, where it might not be, it could be, quite, catastrophic, insofar as, the recommendation of different supplement protocols even, can, that we I used to like recommend supplements a lot as a coach, and then I was like, I'm not doing that at all anymore unless I know everything about this athlete. So it's highly
Yeah.
nuanced. Sorry, you say something.
No, because I also wanted to bring some concrete examples that are a little less scientific. Like we're still looking at ranges of something like ferritin between 20 and 100, in everyone. If I'm an athlete, I should probably not sit at 20. If I'm a female, if I'm pregnant, I should probably not sit at 20. And yet, generally, if my blood test result comes back with ferritin anywhere in that range, it's considered normal. And we could go deeper into energy availability and what used to be called the female athlete triad, when athletes would suffer from amenorrhea, and suddenly something like that range is very important. It's affected by lifestyle, it's affected by temperature, it's affected by altitude. And yet, in most, especially if we're talking about the general public and we're talking longevity, if you ask an LLM what is the range, and you put your blood test results in, it will initially say, yeah, 20 to 100, you're fine. I did testing. I did my inner age, based off the Horvath clock, with one company versus another company. One came back 8 years older and one came back 7 years younger. And I actually realized that the first one I did about a year postpartum. And we know how fundamentally pregnancy and postpartum changes female physiology, and on a cell level, changes the female body on a cell level. And I was at the time really, I was bemused, let's put it this way. They put me very close to 50. But I was also trying to get to the bottom of an understanding of what their recommendations would be as a company, given that it was embarrassing. I'm an athlete. I was healthy, Yes, I had a baby, but I also just run an ultra marathon and did really well. I felt strong. I felt energetic. And the health coach who interviewed me after the test could not for the life of him figure it out, couldn't give me a recommendation. He had his pre-answers. He asked me if I smoked. I said no. And so, I'm sure that he asked the same question of a man, and maybe that man's test would have come back different, but never did it occur to them to ask, for example, have you recently had a child? Or are you breastfeeding? Are you, So I think these things are not fatal, but who knows, like depending on what recommendations get pushed. We're now entering into the wild west of peptides. What people take upon themselves to solve it, because it is embarrassing. All of their friends are biologically 27 and they're 45. I think people will take some radical steps to try to drop that. And so we do need that distinction between the physiologies.
And I think there's something like, yes, with what you're describing, we need to go with the deep dive on the differences in the male versus female biology. But even this notion of like, pulling on that athlete thread a little bit, right? Like, no doubt had like specific training periodization baked into your discipline. The sports generally do. So from what I understand, this is really kind of adapted from a track and field model where you would have, well, first of all, there's a whole athlete development program, which would span like 16 years. Let's say it's a kind of like 4 Olympic cycles. It's like the first Olympic cycle, you learn how to train. The second one, you learn how to compete. And the third one, you learn how to win. You're not necessarily going to all 3 Olympic games. I'm just saying you're kind of training, within those development cycles. But within those kind of 4-year ranges, you have these, macrocycles, these mesocycles, and these microcycles. And, the microcycles tend to be like, there's like an introduction of the activity set that you're training for that particular phase. And then you load onto that. Once you know what it is, you load it, then you load it again, and then you unload or deload. And that's to really give the tendons, this is for track and field, is to give the tendons and ligaments a chance to catch up. Depending on what sport, you can push that longer. Some coaches use, different pulses. But the point is you're using a strategic stress to get a particular compensation. And I'd be interested to know like how an athlete's biological age clock varies throughout the training stress, right? Because I think that's what these tests are looking at, is these epigenetic changes, which are correlating with some kind of stress on the body. And then you're extrapolating, okay, well, you're under stress. And maybe the assumption here is this is a chronic stress. And so therefore this is indicative of chronic disease. And so therefore your chronological age is likely more than your biological age. And I think there's a based on what your experience and what I've heard from other people as well. I think I mean, first of all, it's a really cool thing to just be able to look epigenetically and to get this signal. But it would be really interesting to start to think about now, how do we discern between the signal and the noise? I'm sure somebody's doing this kind of epigenetic studies, and so not only is that interesting from the athlete's perspective, I think there's something to be said there also for childhood trauma, because we know from intergenerational trauma or cultural trauma, like these epigenetic signatures exist that would indicate or be predictive of somebody being higher predisposition for, say, obesity or schizophrenia. So it would be really interesting to, I suspect that the epigenetic sensitivity is only going to increase, like what we saw with 23andMe, for example. Like, I think we've already entered into kind of an epigenetic participation. When I asked you the question, like, how is that going? It was kind of like, well, I know how it's going, I think, because like what you described as, like, you have this incredible gold standard, having been an athlete and have an athlete who understands and trains from the vantage point of the female's biology. And then even to know that, hey, you have these multi-disciplines and just knowing that you're going to get the best result if you train with a ballerina coach for 3 to 5 hours, right? So I guess, how does this become available, and not even available, but approachable to people who like don't have an athletic background?
Yeah. I love that question because, again, my body has lived through being a very normal person and also through, the highest of highs and injuries and all the beauty of being a high level athlete. I think I've always wanted to make whatever I put out accessible to people. I've wanted it to be easy to understand, and for women in particular, I want it to be not something that adds to their mental load. So one of the big things that we discovered and why we pivoted away from consumer was that the noise in the consumer space is massive. Everybody's vying for your attention, especially female attention right now, selling you one more thing. And what when we discussed it with women in particular, also noticed was everybody has everybody has a different opinion on which products they love. So we said to ourselves, if we can come in as an analytics layer and an improvement layer that is female specific for some of these products that women are already using, we meet them where they are. So whether that's a concierge doctor that is very invested in providing the best care, working better informed. So yes, they might already technically let people come in with their like printouts from their wearable, but show me one person in a doctor's office who can actually make sense of that. That needs to be analyzed. You can just spit it out and say, okay, here's the resting heart rate from that person for the last 4 weeks. It has to be understood. Like, the person who reads it has to be understood, and then it has to be put in context with everything else that was going on. So there's a unique opportunity there for us to do those analytics and then give it back to that concierge practice in a way that they can communicate and then also measure trends and improvement after. And it ultimately allows them to deliver on their promise. And if done right, they can also increase their patient volume, because now they're not constrained by having people in their office trying to make sense of all this data that is coming their way. There's an application in digital health and digital wellness and fitness. So if you think of popular companies that have fitness products that you have in your home, let's think of someone like Peloton. Fundamentally, a lot of these companies now are data companies. They get to know us on a level that is quite granular. They know what programs we like which workouts we like. They can know if it's a company where any strength is involved. There's devices that we can do training at home with levers and pulleys. They know how much you're pressing, how much you're pulling, how often you're doing that. But again, it's very isolated to that one machine. If you start adding in the context around that, like how this person is organizing their life, their age, the support that they need, then you meet her where she is. So now you're solving more problems for her by either directing her to the right programs or by adjusting the workload on the machine that you've built. So, and again, that data analytics layer then comes in through integration with us. And then you and I briefly talked about high performance, where we have multimodal teams. And as much as I hate the term, each athlete in a pro team is an asset. And you can only have a successful franchise or a successful team if that asset is protected. Performance teams do their best, but if you look at it, again, we're missing the studies. We still don't know why female athletes tear their ACL 60% more likely than male athletes. It's a season-ending injury. And now, as we're seeing salaries rise in popular sports, that is also a huge gap that a team, a franchise has to fill that costs them a lot of money. So I think those three areas have traditionally focused more on general public or male. And now we've come in and said, look, you don't have to build it from scratch. We're coming in, we're giving you that infrastructure, we're giving you the data analytics layer. And as a result, the care pathways and the support pathways on the other end for your female users are improved, which then creates more engagement, reduces churn, and creates better outcomes.
Okay, so you're the platform infrastructure, you're the analytics layer. You're basically like a B2B product for existing people who have existing customers, particularly focused on female pain points. And so, what kind of data are you quantifying? Is it digital? Is there like omics, like DNA and methylation? Like what does your platform integration look like?
So not yet DNA or not even. So one of the companies that we've looked at working with, we were looking at your agnostic biometrics. We're looking at self-reported symptoms and then a few other metrics. And then we were going to go deeper into inner age, biological age, so epigenetics, and potentially microbiome. And that's, I think, where it gets even more interesting. So as these data points emerge and as there's just more breadth, we're looking to integrate more. But initially, we're keeping it really simple. It's about stress, exercise, nutrition, and sleep. It's about making sure that whoever participates doesn't have to rely on one specific product. So, for example, we're wearable agnostic because, if we weren't, then it just becomes an acquisition channel for the wearable company. But we're actually wanting to, if we're working with a partner, we want everyone that they work with to be able to participate. So um, that's for as much as we can, we try to be lab agnostic as well. So it's not, so if someone comes in with blood test results that are historical, that we don't have to say, well, we can only take your blood test result if it comes from this particular lab, but we'll bring in something you got D2C or something you got from your physician, and then we can compare those trends regardless.
I picked up somewhere in my research, I want to make sure it wasn't a hallucination, but something on, your vision mission around this 75 million year lost life gap for women. Did I imagine that, or did we talk about that previously?
We haven't talked about it yet, but yeah, there's a lot of life lost every year, and I'm trying to remember where I said that and when I said that. It's not something I came up with, but I think cumulatively we lose 75 million years of female life every year. It's an insane statistic due to poor care pathways. But I mean, honestly, I think women are less focused on necessarily the years lost. Every single woman that I ask whether she wants to live to 100 responds that she'd happily live to 75 or 80 as long as her quality of life is good. And so this whole lifespan versus health span question is also a huge one. I think we almost have a responsibility now to show women how good it can be, to then encourage women to want to be much older. Because what we know is that women live disproportionately longer in really poor health.
Well, I promised you I was going to ask 3 questions at the end, right? I think this set us up as that like wonderful jumping off point. We went on this journey from 4-year-old Kenyan prodigy to to preset for elite athlete to let's say genius physiologist in high school, now to modern day professional pentathlete competitor through the UN, and now here you are in this CEO position looking to affect change to solve the 70 million per year loss of life. And so I always like to recap at the end and say, like what is the thing that we've kind of talked around what's the bigger message that we want to distill down to the listeners. It's my first question. Number one is, what's the key takeaway? And then number two is, who we want to have to hear this to affect the kind of change that we're talking about here. And then number three is, who might you nominate as my next guest?
Yeah. The first question is really about, I think, collectively, and I'm saying this from a B2B perspective, I think it's on all the key stakeholders that are currently affecting women's lives from a health and wellness perspective to stop making excuses as to why they cannot distinguish between male and female biology. I think the goal has to be, if we're in a race towards the health operating system, period, is that we need a female health operating system that will make it absolutely clear to us what affects our female ovaries, our brain, our metabolism, obviously also our aging, and many, many, many more aspects, musculoskeletal and so on. It's not, if women are healthy, communities are healthy, and ultimately the world is healthy, right? We bring people into the world and we care for people. And unfortunately, to this day, hear that female health will not return an investment fund, and female sport will not return an investment fund. I hear from companies who go, well, only 40% of our customers are female. Why would we do something specific for them? Because it matters. Because it hasn't been done. Women will reward it 1,000-fold. Because ultimately, women are just looking to be supported and taken care of, and have their mental load reduced. So it's a massive opportunity. And that brings me to number two, which is, I want, again, all of these stakeholders to hear it. I want women to hear it, but this is not news to most women. The one thing that I find time and time again that is news to women is that in most of the systems right now, we have been overlooked. So, for example, a lot of people think that if you wear a wearable, you get a different notification from your partner. Well, I think those individuals need to ask for it and push for it and keep demanding it, because they are paying for it with their hard-earned dollars and their attention. So it's for them. And then it's also for, again, health organizations that have historically been okay with how it's been done. It's been fine, right? Nobody's complained. How bad could it be? Let's complain a bit more and let's get this fixed. And I'm not saying this is going to be just Vitel fixing it. There's a lot of people who can do the fixing. And there's someone, and I hope I'm not going to put him on the spot, but he's a dear advisor of ours. He worked in the US, both as part of scientific advisory board for companies, and then he worked with some of the teams USA. He worked with Team Australia, Olympic team, and he's now back in Australia in preparation for Brisbane 2032. His name is David Martin, and he is one of the best humans and one of the best exercise physiologists that I have met. And I aspire to be as good as him in every sense of the word.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely reach out and extend the invitation. Roma, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I know you just came off a very aggressive travel.
With kids.
With kids. Yeah. So I really do appreciate you gritting through this with me, and for all the work that you have done and you are doing currently, and you no doubt will do. Thank you so much for what you're doing to serve these great women.
Thank you for your questions. This was a pleasure, and it's really rare to have a host who understands every single aspect of my journey. So thank you.
You're being very generous, but I try my best, and it's easy when you've got me so captivated and curious and interested. So again, thank you. Every week on this podcast, I ask my guests what their main message is. Roma's was this: stop making excuses for why we can't distinguish between male and female biology. He's speaking to those helping to usher in the age of scientific wellness. If we are in a race toward the health operating system, we need a female health operating system. Because when women are healthy, communities are healthy, and ultimately the world is healthy. 75 million years. That's how much female life we lose every year to poor care pathways and a data gap we have chosen to tolerate. Roma has lived the highest highs and the lowest lows in her own body, and she is offering that hard-won wisdom to build the infrastructure women have been waiting for. Thank you for joining me this week on The Day in Name of Things.